We'll get started right away with the questions. The first question that we have for you, Elizabeth, is can you discuss the environmental impacts of cremation? And I'm assuming that the person asking this question is referring to the conventional cremation rather than the green cremation that we just learned about.
Yeah, and that's a really great question. I'm glad to be able to answer that because it was the baby boomer generation that said, hey, we don't want to take up that 3,200 square feet for a grave, and we don't want to take up earth, and we want to do things really green. So that's the people born between 46 and 64 were the ones who were really getting big on being cremated. So studies over time have shown the problem with flame cremation is ultimately it's your body, but you're not going into the ground, you're going into the sky. So everything inside you is going up there. What if we don't catch the fact that you have a pacemaker or a defibrillator? That lithium battery blows up and that radioactivity goes out into the universe. The amalgamation, all the mercury in your teeth, what happens with that is that gets burned up, that goes out in the air, and you've got to know when it rains, it comes down to the earth and the little chickens eat it, and ultimately we're eating it again. And it flies many, many miles and lands on our farmlands and lands on our food. So the circle of life is a really important thing here. Also the fossil fuels. To start up a machine for burial, we have, for cremation, 1,800 degrees. So that's going to be about 3 hours of 1,800 degrees. It could be butane, it could be electricity, fossil fuel, it can be whatever it is, but heck, to get it that hot and to keep it that hot, that's a lot of resource going out for one person, lots. So water, the neat thing about the water, again, the low carbon footprint, the circle of life, that idea that effluent, which happens, I have families who take that home with them and they water their garden. There's other people who can use that to do things with. Somebody once said, oh yeah, you can drink it because it's fully natural. And I don't know if I can quite back that claim or if I can even support it or even, perpetuate that, but maybe not the best idea. But it is something that you can do to take home and you can water and do what you need to do, which is nice.
Very good. We have another question here. If you live in Washington, can the body be transported to Oregon without embalming?
100%. So I'm glad that question was asked too, because people have often said, well, I want my mom cremated, but we don't want her embalmed first. And I think people have thought that once a funeral home comes and brings your loved one into their care, embalming happens right away. There's this mad rush to preserve your person. And nobody can embalm your loved one without the next of kin signing an authorization for that. So that's definitely a family choice. To be buried, to be cremated, to be transported, you do not need to be embalmed. How the state rules work, there's official wording. If somebody passes away within 24 hours, what standardly happens per most states is they want somebody to be either buried, embalmed, cremated, or refrigerated. So if you're going to bring your person from someplace in Washington to someplace in Oregon, you're going to be out of refrigeration, quote unquote, for so many hours. Again, you're fine. If you think you might be a longer drive, it's 100 degrees, you don't have air conditioning in your vehicle, then we can always use other methods of cooling. We can use a cooling blanket, we can use gel packs, we can use different types of ice. So again, there's the standard rules and regulation, but that's just a wide blanket. In there's other things you can do. So specifically to answer your question, no, to transport your person across state lines, they do not need to be embalmed. There also is no embalming police. There's nobody who's going to stop you and inspect your loved one. And your loved one truly is your own. You're welcome to have them in your vehicle. Your loved one could pass away at the hospital and you can say, I want my loved one to come to my house for a little bit so we can bathe them, or just so the neighbors can come and we can play our flute. And you have the right to do that because your loved one is your property.
Great, thank you for that answer. Just a reminder to everybody that is in the webinar right now, just type your questions into the chat box at the bottom. It should be at the bottom right of your screen, and that'll come directly to me and I'll read out your questions to Elizabeth. The next question that we have, are there toxic chemicals involved in conventional cremation?
Well, you're really using heat, and it's really just going to be a flame. And then a body ultimately is becoming smaller because of the flame. So there aren't chemicals that are used on the body for any sort of accelerant, any sort of preservation, any sort of anything. It's just a matter of, let's say you're inside a wood casket. Well, if that wood casket has varnishes and has sealers and is coated and has toxic glue, all that is getting burnt and going out in the atmosphere. So that is definitely one way that can be out there if you're just cremated by yourself, because some people still want standard flame cremation. And my job as a funeral director is to provide all the options possible and say, here are all the things you can do, and anything you want is absolutely fabulous. So if you did want a standard cremation, again, the most natural way to do that would be to be in, you have to be in a rigid container. So if the crematory, what have you, can provide just a basic standard cardboard box, or you could have some sort of a lowering board, which is made of natural pine. And then if you aren't wearing clothing, or what you're wearing is not synthetic, and if you can, again, not have chemicals, but that gets into a fine line. What if you've had chemotherapy? Well, okay, you're going to be riddled with lots of chemicals. What if you eat at McDonald's every day of your life? Hey, you're going to be riddled with lots of chemicals. So I think ultimately we try to have shades of green. I think if you want to be a green person, you can try to be as green as you want. I've never seen a 100% green burial. And the reason why is there's a family who said, okay, we're going to do this in our yard. We're going to dig by hand. We're going to eat off the sustainable vegetables in the garden. Our loved one is going to be nude. Nothing is going to be not green. Well, but all the people who showed up driving their own cars, one passenger to the car, they all showed up in their leather shoes, and then half of them were holding their, Starbucks cup that isn't recyclable. It kind of, it's not as perfectly green as we want. But again, we really try for the shades of green. So you could have your standard cremation and try to green it up as much as possible. That'd be lovely.
Awesome, thank you for that answer. We've had 2 questions come in about composting and any information that you might have about composting burial. It's apparently something that has been talked about recently. I've actually seen ads for this in social media. There are certain sites that offer to grow a tree with your remains. I believe that is what the questions are referring to.
So let me give you a couple different answers just to make sure we're covering all of this. A while back, there was something called cremation, and this was in Scandinavia. And this was the idea of being freeze-dried. And then you'd be laid on somewhat of a table, vibrating, and then your parts would be broken up, and you'd have little pieces that you could compost, you could put into the garden, and you could go back to nature that way. That's something which is not a form of disposition in the United States, as well as obviously Oregon and Washington, so something you can't do. Occasionally in social media, we'll see these things that are pods. We'll see these wonderful trees, and it's a huge shape of an egg pod, and a person is inside it, and then they're buried in some sort of a forest, and they can become a tree. Well, that's something, the company who is mostly part of that is Capsula Mundi. They are in Italy. And again, this is a working concept. It's something which isn't a form of disposition in the United States. It's a lovely, fantastic idea. But again, it's a work in progress. And then thirdly, Katrina Spade, who is based in Washington, has something which is called Decompose. And she's worked at this for a very, very long time. She has a wonderful TEDx talk, which she talks about how you can become compost. And so that is a lot of good information. She also has a website. You can Google the words recompose, and you can find out what that's about. That's something which she's trying to get up and running. I think she has the projected date of maybe 2023 in the Seattle area to start, but that's morphed a little bit, and it's a very fascinating concept. It will, definitely change the playing field of what people do with themselves. But I think, so those are the 3 areas, I think, when people think about not necessarily having a burial, but becoming compost. I believe all 3 of those ideas covered that.
Awesome, thank you. We've got a question. How long does it take for the body to completely decompose in the natural areas?
Well, great question. And it's hard to speak to that because there are so many reasons. One, are you in the tundra of Alaska? Are you in the desert of Arizona? Are you a very large person? Are you a skeletal person? Do you have full areas in your body that are really full of chemotherapy? Did you eat granola your whole life? All of those things matter. Ultimately, to become one with nature, let's say you're placed into the earth in a biodegradable container, there aren't the standard contaminants in you, such as the formaldehyde, everything around you is going to break down into the soil. I mean, bones will still be there. We can still dig up bones. So you never fully go into becoming nothing. As far as your tissue breaking down, it depends on what's going on in the ecostructure of the ground. That's why it's a little bit hard. And people will say to me, well, what happens when you're embalmed? How long do you last? Well, what's the table water of where you are? You know, how is the grave, is that going to be full of wetness and moisture? I mean, there's just so many factors that go into it. So it's a little bit tricky to say this is the scientific proof specifically of this happens in every region and to every type of body and how you've treated your body over time. And then of course, what you're buried in, and, you know, are you buried in that fantastic synthetic, you know, satin ball gown compared to maybe just your cotton sheet.
Very good. With green burial, will the role of funeral homes diminish? Without embalming, it seems like families could work directly with a green burial cemetery.
Yes, and I'm so thrilled to answer that question and say, right now I believe that there are 40 states which allow families to have someone stand in as the funeral home or the funeral director or the funeral services practitioner. There's a lot of wonderful people out there. If you've not heard of an end-of-life doula or a home funeral guide, all these people out there, all these groups of people who are there to help you move your body and move your loved one from their processing and transitioning to the end of life. Having a hired funeral director, going into a funeral home, picking out itemized goods and services on a price list. No, most times you really don't have to do it. There are some states that say, nope, you have to have a funeral director involved. The funeral director is the only person who can transport, the only person who can get a death certificate signed, the only person who can oversee disposition. But many other states are saying no. And so what I love to tell families is say, this is great. If you have an interest, wonderful. I'll point you to all the websites, all the packets of information, everything you need to be able to make all this happen on your own. And you don't have to necessarily have a home funeral and then have your person buried in your yard. Some people want to do everything themselves, but they want to transport their loved one to the aqua dissolution machine, or they want to decide to bring their loved one to a cemetery. So even up to that part, you're right, you could fully do everything yourself. You could also contract directly with some of these businesses and say, we're going to provide our own cooling, we're going to get our own paperwork. What do you need from us? And what I always tell people is, if this is something you want to do, try to have a little bit of time. You can do this once someone passes away. You can say, you know what, I want to do everything myself, and it will work. But to make it easier, because this isn't the most common way to go about things, if you have already done some of your due diligence, such as talk to the hospital or the nursing home or the hospice team and said, okay, we're not calling a funeral home, so please don't ask me, who's your mortuary? We're not doing that. We're doing that ourselves. This is what we want to do. Sometimes you have to really work to get everybody on board, because they'll say, oh, well, that's not how we do these things, or oh, that's illegal, or oh gosh, oh, the coroner needs to do this or that. And you'll find out a lot of times people just don't have the information they need. That's why I'm so thrilled to see all your names on the screen, knowing all of you you're making time on a gloriously sunny Wednesday evening to say, how do I do some of this myself? Where do I get these answers? So I know my answers sort of go all over the place, but I just want to make sure that you're getting all of the information, and maybe even what we're talking about springboards to a next question. And this allows you to have some of that too. So you're welcome to do what you need to do. And do know you're not failing if you decide you've caretake that person, you've been up with them, you haven't slept, and you just don't have the energy to get a doctor to sign a death certificate and get the form and write it out and sit in the office, and you want to hire a funeral home to do that. Again, you can have a funeral home take care of the bits and pieces. You can just give everything to a funeral home. You can assign them all the duties, or you can work with them and say, okay, this is my goal. This is my dream. This is what I want to do. How can we do this mutually together where you as a family can get what you want, but you're not burdened with stuff? And let me tell you, getting a doctor to sign a death certificate and getting that onto the county and getting the death, it is such a daunting process. It takes so long to do. So if there's one piece that you just think I need to hand over to somebody, that would probably be the best piece to hand over to the funeral home.
Awesome, thank you, and we do appreciate the detail. We've got two questions that came in kind of in the same vein, so I'm going to give them both to you at the same time. They come from people who are interested in knowing what steps they would need to follow after setting a personal intention to be buried in a greener process. The two questions are, how can I assure that I will be buried naturally? Do I need this stated in a will? And the second one is, do I need some sort of special language, form, or hoop to go through to have my wishes fulfilled to have a natural burial in Washington?
Okay, these are great questions. I'm so glad someone brought up the will. The will, the will. That is such a daunting thing for funeral directors. The will is only made for your financial things. Sometimes somebody has made up their plan and said, oh, I'm going to put it in my will. Let's say your will is in a safety deposit box. You know who gets into your safety deposit box? That happens once somebody has already had a certified copy of the death certificate to be able to get in your safety deposit box. And you know how you had the death certificate? Someone's already gone into a funeral home. They've already made your plan. They probably have already disposed of you. So you've really defeated your purpose by locking something away in a will. The easiest way to get what you want is talk to your next of kin. Who is in charge of you? Mostly how this works is your first line next of kin would be either your spouse, your registered domestic partner. Okay, so that person is your next of kin. Get them on board. Tell them, this is what I want, this is how I want to do it. Therefore, there's no special language, there's no documentation, there's no paperwork. The person who loves you says, oh, okay, thanks for telling me, because you know what, if you died, I'd have no idea what to do. So it's a wonderful gift to have the conversation. If you don't have a spouse, don't have a registered domestic partner, then the adult child comes in. If you have a developmentally able child who's adult, then they would be the people who would be called on to act on your behalf. If those people aren't in place, then it goes to a parent who is still capable and functional and able to do this. And then the next layer would be sibling. After that, then again, it depends on what state you're in, but a lot of times a cousin or an aunt or a grandparent or a friend or somebody else can come forward and do this. But find your appointed person. People have come to me and said, my adult children, they're not gonna, they think I'm crazy. Wonderful. So then you find your person, you find your neighbor, you find a partner, you find your best friend, your cousin, whomever, and then you put them in charge of your paperwork, and you go through the documentation of making them your durable power of attorney for your finances, and then that way they can go ahead and they can handle things. And what you really could do is you could either go into a funeral home and sign up and buy and do and get to your cemetery and buy your plot and do all those things, but you know, not everybody has the money to do those things. Not everybody wants to do that because it makes your death that much closer, but having the conversation and letting somebody know this is what I want. So that's another reason why I do these conversations and conferences for people is you might say, I want a green burial. And I'll get phone calls from people saying, hi, my dad died and he said he wants a green burial. I have no idea what that is, but all I was told was to call you because he wants a green burial. Luckily, they called somebody who can walk you through everything, but there's still more decisions. Wonderful, he wants to have a green burial. The two big things that we need to talk about, what type of container does he want to be buried in, or now that he's no longer alive, what are you comfortable with? And where do we want this burial to happen? There are many cemeteries across the United States. As a matter of fact, every one of our 50 states have cemeteries, at least one, which will allow natural burial. Just here alone in the Portland, Oregon area, there are 9 that will allow natural burial. More and more are coming within the southern Washington area, which is lovely as well. So there's plenty of choices, plenty of places are allowing this, but really telling your person, if I had my preference or if the money was available, I really would like to be laid to rest in this space. And that's really helpful. Also, do you want to have a celebration of life? Do you want to have these things? Funeral planning used to be what church, what songs, what flowers, but we don't really do that anymore, especially on the West Coast. It's really a matter of, okay, we have your physical vehicle, we need to do something with it. What's going to happen? 80% of West Coasters choose direct cremation, which is just a matter of, okay, I can fax, I can email my signature to the funeral home, we can go ahead and either they can mail me through the United States mail or we can come in a couple days and pick up ashes and off we go. Most people choose that option actually. So if you want to do that, fabulous, but make it known and get paperwork in order, talk to people. But the main thing is have your next of kin, whoever is responsible for you, be that trusted person to carry out your wishes.
Awesome. Very good advice. Thank you. Elizabeth, can you speak to the impacts on water quality that occur from green burial? Do decaying bodies have an impact on groundwater?
So water burial, I think we're talking about burial at sea.
Actually, I'll just read the question one more time. Can you speak to the impacts to water quality that occur from green burial? Do decaying bodies have an impact on groundwater? So I think that the person asking the question is thinking about impacts on groundwater aquifers. So I don't think it's actually referring to burial at sea.
Okay, sure. So if you're buried in the ground and you've been embalmed, ultimately your body is going to not be in its standard form over time. And then all of that formaldehyde does get leached into the water table and does go down into the ground. If you don't have these chemicals in your body, we're pretty darn healthy. You've seen different places where people have had plane wrecks and unfortunately they've had to eat the other humans. We're pretty tasty. We're pretty healthy. Our meat is pretty good. We ultimately are fine. And I know that sounds a little bit graphic, but it's really true. Your loved one who's at home, you bathe them, your loved one, you're with them. The moment they pass away, it's still mom right there who you've bathed and you've loved and you've dressed and all those things. All of a sudden you don't have to break out the eyewear and the gloves and the sheets and all these things. That's still your mama, and you're still okay to touch them and love them and be with them. I know the time of COVID makes everything so much more scary, but ultimately you are going to be fine in your regular form, being laid into the earth. The fungi, all that is going to be happy to see you. You're going to become one with nature. You're going to become a tree, and the groundwater will thank you and be happy you're there.
Awesome. Just a follow-up question on that. You talked earlier about the issues with conventional cremation if somebody had certain toxins in them, perhaps associated to chemotherapy treatment or probably other sort of medical treatments that they've had. Is that a consideration for anybody who is looking into green burial? Do they need to think about dealing with any part of their body that may contain toxins prior to being part of the green burial process?
No, and that's a really, really wonderful question. I appreciate that. Let's say you're at stage 4 and you've had a lot of radical therapy to help you possibly have more quality of life, and unfortunately time has come and you've passed and there's all these chemicals inside you, or even opioids or pills or all these things that are synthetic that are inside us that are not natural, but again to help us. If you are having a flame cremation, all of that goes out into the air, into the atmosphere. If you're going to have an aqua cremation, all that is neutralized inside the water bath. Think about that. That's amazing. With the potassium hydroxide, it's just neutralized inside the water. All right. Now, if you're going to have a natural burial, again, the earth is so powerful and there's so much going on underneath the ground that we're unaware of. There's a whole microcosm under there and everything happening that you just become one with the soil. Of course, there is going to be some of what's inside of you is going to be there. Just like when we drive across the street, some of those fuels are going to go someplace. We always leave a bit of a footprint behind because that's just what happens. But you going into the soil, it's not going to be nearly a big of a deal as if you were surrounded in a casket with steel that broke down, and over time that steel was leached into the soil and contaminated that way. Or if the toxins from the shellacked casket, all of those glosses and all that broke down and got into the water. Us as a natural form, we're pretty darn amazing. Our bodies can heal ourselves, our bodies can work through a lot, and a human body and the soil work pretty darn well together as a great team.
Awesome. Thank you for clarifying that. So the next question we have is, once a death certificate has been obtained, am I legally required to say how the body was dealt with? Or just...
Okay, yeah, so that's a good question. I will give this to you from the perspective of Oregon and the perspective of Washington, because it's the two different ways here. Let's say I have a death in Oregon, and let's say I'm acting as the funeral home, or let's say a family member is acting as the funeral provider. Either way, they're the person who's in charge of disposition. When a doctor signs a death certificate, or a nurse practitioner, or a medical director, or a naturopath, whomever is signing it, they're of course going to put the causes of death, and they're going to put how long it took for someone to pass away, if there's anything else that we need to know. And then there's a line on there where we're actually putting down the form of disposition and where the form of disposition is happening. So let's say you're going to cremate somebody and their ashes, you're going to scatter them over Mount St. Helens. You don't have to put Mount St. Helens, but what you do need to put is the name of the crematory and the city and the state of that. And that's something which is on there, and that's part of a death certificate, as we need to keep track of people. And not only do we need to know their social security number, where they were born, but the form of disposition is on the death certificate. It's not merely a piece of paper like a prescription, like the doctor just signs their name and writes a couple things. This is all the legal information. So you can't get away from not having the cause of death already on a certificate, nor can you get away from what you are doing with the body. As far as scattering the ashes, sure, but it needs to say burial at sea, it needs to say transport out of state, all of those steps on there. And then from there, in Oregon, for instance, you just need to have some medical professional, medical examiner, whomever's involved with some medical care of that person say, yes, we will sign the certificate. Then you can move forward with your cremation, your burial, what have you. In the state of Washington, it's a little bit trickier. If somebody passes away in Washington, not only do you have to have somebody with medical history on that person be willing to sign the certificate, they have to have it signed, and then it needs to get registered in the county where the person died. And then there is a transit permit, a burial permit, or some sort of permit which allows you to go ahead and take care of your next step. So it's a little bit trickier in Washington. It's not a matter of you have to have all those things in place. Most death certificates in Washington are done over an electronic system. So if you are passing away in Washington, it really behooves you to ask a funeral home to go ahead and take care of those steps for you, because they can push the buttons. This can get done in 24 to 48 hours. They can get certified. They can get all the things they need, and then you're off to do whatever you want to do. As a standard person, it's going to be a little bit trickier for you to do those things. But again, on the Washington death certificate, we're going to have the cause of death, and then we're also going to have where you're going. So yes, you do have to have your form of disposition. And if it's private land, for instance, it doesn't have to have anything registered. It can just say private residence. It can just have, you know, the city and the state, what have you. It doesn't have to be who holds the deed and all this other stuff. It's not that nosy, but at least we have to have some record of something.
Okay, great, thank you. So we've got time for just a few more questions. Again, just type your questions into the comment box if you haven't done so already. The next question is, what would need to occur to allow burial on private property in the state of Washington? Legislation?
Okay, so with the state of Washington, what I would highly encourage somebody to do if they wanted to, right now as it stands, have a burial in Washington, they would have to look up the licensing requirements. There is a rule that governs cemeteries. I can give you this. It's chapter 68.20. So it's 68.20, and that's the revised code for Washington. And that allows you to have all the information of what you have to do to bury somebody on private property. Ultimately, if the question is a larger sphere question, such as, well, wait a second, no, what I meant was, how do we get the state of Washington to do this? A lot of the burial, it's per state, but then it breaks down to county, such as in Oregon. I'm in Clackamas County. We can have burial here if it's in the rural part, but the county next to me is Multnomah. That's our large county, which houses Portland, which is, of course, our large metropolitan city. Multnomah County says, heck no, no private land burial. And I've had one street of people. They said, look, we've all lived here 40 years. We're in the middle of nowhere. We've all gotten together and we want you to be able to call the county on our behalf, and we want to all be buried in our yards. We all own 10 acres. We're in the middle of nowhere. Our whole street agrees. What's the problem? And I thought, you people are amazing. This is such organization. This is great. But I gave them the number of, now you're the landowner. Here's who you, and of course, Multnomah County still says, no, I'm sorry, no private land burial. So you might get a no for quite a while, but all those no's. What do they say about sales? You ask 7 times and then pretty soon someone will acquiesce, what have you. How I did my first land burial here in a yard in Clackamas County was about 15 years ago. I had just come out here to the funeral home in Boring, Oregon, and a family called me and they said, we're a intentional community. We want our loved one, they died here, we want them to stay here, we want to bury them here. How do we do this? And I had to say to them, okay, I don't know. I've never done this before, but I would love to help you figure this out. So we went through all the steps, and ultimately, after calling the board and the county and all these places, we called the zoning department. This is something, the county has a zoning department. We called them finally and said, we have a family, they want to have a private land burial. And finally someone called me back and they said, oh, okay, well, so the owner of the property, did they give their permission? Yes. I gave the address. They looked at it and they said, well, it looks like it's so many acres, and I guess. And it was just sort of this vague, well, you know, nothing's stopping you type thing. So we went ahead and we were able to do it. And we found out there was nothing on the books that said we couldn't. So burying somebody on private property, when you legally can, by the way, is very easy. Getting a permit, it's not like you're building an addition to your garage. It's just a matter of, with the death certificate is a piece of paper and it merely says private residence and an address. It's not this big whole thing that you have to apply for the permit and pay all this money. All those barriers that we think are there really aren't. People can tell us no, but there's always something that we can work around or try to figure it out as we go. So with Washington State, think about this. If you've been able to have more cemeteries open up for natural burial, you've been able to have the water, aqua, cremation get voted in, you now are the first state where people are excited about composting people. I would have to say Washington is pretty darn primed to be able to go to the next step and allow home burial in places where people have some acreage and they're not within the city limits. There's really not much stopping y'all from doing that.
Awesome. So we've got time for just a few more questions here, 10 minutes left. I just want to remind everybody that we will be sending out a list of resources tomorrow along with the survey. It would be very helpful if as many people could fill that survey out as possible. We're also going to be sending out, we send out regular newsletters from the Green Neighbors website. Feel free to sign up there. If you haven't signed up already, you're going to find out about some really great events, including the virtual natural garden tour, which is happening this year. That's going to be extremely exciting. You'll be able to see some of the best natural areas in Clark County. That's going to be on the 20th of July. Just go to clarkgreenneighbors.org/garden tour to sign up there. So just 3 more questions for you here, Elizabeth.
Mm-hmm.
are there good resources for planning for green burial in Southwest Washington, either on the web or book resources? And I'm assuming some of those resources are the ones that you've sent to me before that will be sent out tomorrow.
Yeah, there's a woman named Holly Pruitt who is a celebrant here in Oregon, and she has a website called Oregon Funerals. And with that is wonderful information. I realize a lot of that's Oregon, but a lot of that is Washington as well. And it's just a lot of resources and links and a lot of information about how you can figure out what you want to do. National Home Funeral Association also has a lot of like-minded people who have a lot of different information there. I think joining Facebook groups and different things where people talk about these things. You also have a Funeral Consumers Alliance in Washington called People's Memorial. That's an idea too, where you can get a hold of what's going on and what's shaken out. And you can actually call your local funeral home and see what they have to say. Some are all excited, like I am, and want to help you with this. Others say, well, it's not on our price list and it's not really what we do. But, you know, again, there's many, many, many people out there, many end-of-life doulas. There's many home funeral guides. There's a lot of people who have so much information about this.
Awesome. So the next question that we have is about sea burial. Are there designated areas for burial at sea, and would that method be an efficient and rapid way for the body to return to nature?
Yeah, that's a great question. I really like how you phrase that too. So burying your loved one at sea, you need to be obviously the nautical miles off of the coast. You have to have a captain of a boat who knows what he's doing. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, they oversee the U.S. laws and the regulations for the burials at sea. So we need to be 3 miles off the coast, an ocean depth of about 600 feet. And there's paperwork. And again, if you look at New England burials at sea, that website, I think, has the most in-depth information that I've been able to find that allows people to know, well, what would happen and what would this look like and what does this mean and what does this cost? And I think that's a really great place for reference to look.
Awesome. Okay, if there's anybody else who has a question, just type it in now. We're getting some comments. You are so wonderful, Elizabeth. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Gosh, thank you. Then thank you for being here on this glorious evening talking about a topic which is somewhat uncomfortable. If any of you are on Instagram, I'm at Elizabeth Green Reaper, and what I try to do is post pictures of natural burials and different caskets people have made and kind of walk you through some of the stuff. So I try to give you a picture to see things as a visual, but also sort of give you the story or the outline, because that's really what it comes down to. We can talk about why we should have a green burial, but we don't always know how. And the main thing is, how does it feel? Why would you want to do this? What does this look like when people do this? Who does this? I think a lot of those questions come up. It's sort of this neat idea, but how the heck do I get there?
And if folks want to connect with you directly or talk more, what would be the best way to reach out to you?
Call me on the phone. Send me an email. It's fantastic. You know, I have a website called cornerstonefuneral.com. Lots of information on there. Even if you are nowhere near Boring, Oregon, there's information. Also, you can email me, Elizabeth@cornerstonefuneral.com, or call my phone number, and I answer the phone, and I can talk you through things and help you with things. And people sometimes will say, hi, I live in Nova Scotia. Where do I have a green burial? And you know what? I'm thrilled to help. I love this stuff. I'm thrilled to have people excited about this stuff. And the point of having information is to share it.
And your book, the Green Burial Guidebook, if people want to find that book, access that book, where should they go?
Well, the first thing I tell people is go to your local library. Get it free. Get it in a recycled purpose. So local library, I know you can't always walk in. You can get it on some sort of you can order it or what have you. Also, many bookstores have it. I think the least expensive place to buy it is Amazon.com. So that's probably a good thing. And then people swing by the funeral home occasion and say, hey, I wanted to meet you, and can you sign a book? And I've got a couple here as well. But yeah, Amazon, I think, is your least expensive source.
Awesome. Okay, we just have a few more comments rolling in. Thanks so much, Elizabeth. A few of us are from Canada, and I found this webinar very informative, and it's a fabulous book. So we are almost at time here. If anybody else has any final comments, just send it through right now. Otherwise, I think we'll end this webinar just about 4 minutes early. Definitely got a lot of information here that we're going to need to digest, and we really appreciate everybody being part of this. I know that it's not an easy thing to talk about. When I first started thinking about this, I was a little bit uncomfortable, but through listening to you, Elizabeth, and researching it a little bit more, I've learned a lot, and importantly, been able to think about something that's been hard to think about in the past for me. So thank you. I really appreciate it.
My absolute pleasure. And I'm waving at all of you. I don't know if you can see me. Hello. Thank you for being here.